The Russo-Japanese War was fought between Japan and Russia in the early 20th century. At that time, Japan was still a small, underdeveloped Asian country, less than 40 years after the Meiji Revolution. How hard would it have been for Japan, which had just begun to modernize, to fight against Russia? Hirobumi Edo, a former member of the Meiji Order, was adamantly opposed to war with Russia. He had studied abroad before the Meiji Restoration and was well aware of the mighty military power of the West. First of all, let's compare the national and military power of Russia and Japan at that time. It has 3 times the population, 8 times the national revenue, and 8 times the military power. If you think about it normally, you wouldn't even think of starting a war. Nevertheless, Japan was victorious. The Asian countries that had been colonized by the West rejoiced in this victory. The first Prime Minister of India, Jawaharlal Nehru, said, "Japan has won and achieved its desire to join the ranks of the great powers." The victory of Japan, an Asian country, had a great impact on all Asian countries. I used to tell you as a boy, Nehru was 17 at the time, how thrilled I was by it. Many Asian boys, girls and adults experienced the same thrill. The great powers of Europe have been defeated. Then Asia can still defeat Europe, as it has often done in the past. Let's start with the events leading up to the start of the war. To begin with, we must talk about the period after Japan won the war with China, when in the 1890s, Japan and the Qing dynasty were vying to confirm the status of the Yi dynasty and gain control of the Korean peninsula. Then in 1984, Japan started a war with the Qing dynasty and won. Japan signed a post-war treaty with the Qing. The Qing renounced its suzerainty over Korea, recognized Korea's independence, ceded Taiwan and the Liaodong Peninsula, and granted a large sum of compensation. The Western powers were astonished at the part of the treaty that called for the cession of the Liaodong Peninsula. Even though the Qing dynasty was a rotten power, it was still a great power, and none of the Western powers had made explicit demands for the cession of territory that would have led to war. It was Russia that revealed its ambition for the Qing when it learned of the defeat in this war. Russia was hoping to acquire a nice free port in East Asia and was expanding its territory in East Asia. Japan's acquisition of the Liaodong Peninsula was very inconvenient for Russia, which had its sights set on Manchuria. Even if Japan acquired the Liaodong Peninsula, Japan did not have the economic power to develop it and secretly approached only Britain for joint management of the Liaodong Peninsula region. When this fact came to light, Russia hardened its stance even further. Russia, together with Germany and France, demanded that Japan return the Liaodong Peninsula to the Qing. The Russians were prepared to go to war to meet their demands. Japan secretly hoped that the British would act as an intermediary, but they had no intention of supporting Japan until they had fallen out with Russia. Japan could not win a war against the 3 countries, so it accepted the request and allowed the Liaodong Peninsula to be returned to the Qing. This incident is known as the 3 countries intervention. This incident triggered a surge of anti-Russian sentiment in Japan and led the Japanese military to study Russia as a possible enemy. In 1898, Russia obtained the lease of Dalian and Lushun from the Qing and the right to build the South Manchurian Railway. Lushun and Dalian are cities on the Liaodong Peninsula that Japan was forced to abandon due to the 3-power intervention. Even when the land abandoned by the Russians was occupied by the Russians, Japan could not take any action against the Russians. Of course, the anti-Russian momentum was at its peak in Japan. Russia's intentions for Manchuria and even Korea are becoming clearer. In 1900, the Yihedan rebelled in the Qing dynasty. This was an anti-foreigner movement similar to the one that took place in Japan at the end of the Tokugawa shogunate, and targeted Westerners and Japanese in the Qing. 8 countries sent troops to the Qing Empire to protect their citizens. Russia and Japan sent a large number of people to the area. Even after the suppression of this rebellion, Russia stationed its troops in Manchuria and kept Manchuria under its control. This control of Manchuria by Russia posed a great threat to Japan. There was another country that felt threatened by Russia's invasion of the Qing. That was Britain. The British also wanted to invade the Qing, but they had their hands full with the Boer War and could not afford to take on the Russians. This is where the Japanese and British intentions towards Russia coincided. Britain, which had been proud of its honorable isolation and had not allied itself with any other Western country, formed an alliance with Japan. The Anglo-Japanese Alliance was signed in 1902. It said that if one country went to war, the other country would remain neutral. If one country went to war with two other countries, the other country would join the war. Japan also hoped that this would be a strong deterrent to Russia. With this alliance with Britain as a backdrop, Japan began negotiations with Russia in 1903. In exchange for Japan's recognition of Russia's interests in Manchuria, Russia would recognize Japan's interests in Korea. Russia, which thought it had the military advantage, did not accept this condition. Russia wants the northern half of Korea. This was not a condition that Japan could accept, and the negotiations ended in failure. It was at this time that Japan began to prepare for war. Although Hirobumi Ito was adamantly opposed to war with Russia, Aritomo Yamagata, another former military commander, insisted on going to war. The prime minister at the time, Taro Katsura, was also in favor of war. Yamagata and others were of the opinion that war with Russia was inevitable, and if it was to be fought, it should be now, when the Trans-Siberian Railway was not yet completed, and the longer it took, the worse off Japan would be. Ito was persuaded by Yamagata and others, and stated that if the Russians were to land in Japan, he would become a soldier and fight against them. Thus, in February 1904, Japan cut off diplomatic relations with Russia. It was Russia that was surprised by this severance of diplomatic relations. Russia had thought that it was Russia, not Japan, that would decide whether to go to war or not. They did not think that Japan, with its inferior national power, would fight Russia. Thus began the Russo-Japanese War. In the next article, I will explain Japan's preparations for war and foreign currency acquisition. If you find it interesting, please subscribe to our channel and click the like button.